Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's Feliciano Live. We are here with Dr. Luis Portes. He is a professor of economics here at the Feliciano School of Business. Today's topic is Trump's tariff plan. Will it cause a trade war? And we're here with Dr. Portes, who's going to talk about the tariffs and give his opinion on what's going on currently in the industry. So as we progress through this interview, feel free to ask questions live, and we'll get to as many as we can. So let's start with the first question, which Dr. Portes, what are tariffs and why are they used?
Great. Thank you, Phil. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Let me just tell you briefly how we're going to work on this. There are 7 questions. The first 6 are going to go relatively fast. I'll just set up the background. And then on the 7th one, that's when we're going to go a little deeper on understanding this whole situation that can be quite confusing. So, Phil, your question was?
So, question number 1, what are tariffs and why are they used?
So, tariffs are basically taxes on imports. This is a tool of trade policy. Countries have it at their disposal, and it allows foreign products to come in at a higher price by imposing the tariff. So, this gives some certain protection to the local industries. That's the main goal. And if we were to sprinkle it a little bit with theory, what happens in the medium run with tariffs is that as resources get reallocated towards the imported industry, in this case steel, then there's an increase in the supply of steel, prices tend to go down, but there's a reshuffle from the export industry. So there are fewer resources for exports, the price of exports go up. So in the long run, we would have higher price of exports, lower price of imports, which is a good situation for a country. However, there is going to be a response by trading partners. So that's where the theory ends.
So welcome everyone for joining us today. We are here with Dr. Luis Portes, who is a professor of economics here at the Feliciano School of Business. We're talking about Trump's tariff plan and will it cause a trade war? And our second question, and if you have questions, feel free to ask those questions as we're progressing through the interview. Our second question is, what is President Trump's rationale behind implementing tariffs of 25% on imported steel and 10% on aluminum from Canada, Mexico, and the EU?
The main story that has been provided is a national security concern. A study that started by the Department of Commerce in April of last year. Here you have the real thing. So this is the effect of steel imports on the U.S. This is part of a faculty that the president has under a 1962 Act of Congress and Trade. And what we have is that based on national security concerns, the administration is suggesting that we should increase tariffs to raise the capacity utilization of the existing steel industry.
Great. So for those who just joined us, we're here with Dr. Luis Portes. He's a professor here in the Department of Economics at the Feliciano School of Business. We're talking about the Trump tariff plan and will it cause a trade war? If you have questions, feel free to ask those questions. We'll get to as many as we can. Our third question is, what impact will these tariffs have on U.S. prices of goods and services?
Well, the impact is one of the things that's most important. First of all, in the near future, we can expect higher prices because you're taxing foreign products, and therefore that becomes the new reference price. On the other hand, we have the story of the spillover effects. It's not only directly affecting the steel industry, but every other industry that uses steel, from automobiles, aircraft manufacturing, machinery, and other iron and related metal production. So what we have seen and people have cited is that about 5 million people can be affected by the increase in steel prices, 5 million jobs.
Great. So before we get to our next question, again, we're here with Dr. Portes from the Department of Economics here at the Feliciano School of Business. We're talking about the Trump tariff plan and will it cause a trade war? So our fourth question is, what are the positive outcomes, if any, expected to result from this plan for the U.S.?
From a narrow perspective, definitely the steel industry is to benefit because they will exhibit certain degree of protection that can bring online former steel mills that are idle. And there's a concern that the capacity has been decreasing. Certain units have been shut down. Some are idle. So with higher prices, with this protection, we can bring more of this online. That will help some employment in the industry as well as the firm's operating margins.
Great. Our next question, number 5, will the U.S. lose relations with specific trade partners?
And that is the biggest problem of them all. It seems that our trading partners have been surprised by this move in the U.S. government, especially based on the nature of national security as a concern for doing it. The way the national security is defined is that in case of emergency, the country should be able to supply for itself one whole year of industrial output, steel associated, defense use of steel, and even civilian use of steel, to be self-sufficient. And that is basically the definition of national security that it's being invoked.
So we have a live question here. It's from Ian Green. As a net importer, does the U.S. have the advantage in a trade war, or does being a net importer pose a disadvantage to the U.S. in trade negotiations?
Well, yeah, we import about 30% of steel. And the numbers are roughly easy to imagine because our consumption is in the order of 100 million tons per year. We import about 30, so 30% comes from abroad. There are different categories of steel imports. So, yeah, as a net importer, there will be a more direct effect on higher prices. Yeah. So the purpose of the policy will be more effective given that we are net importers of steel, but as you say, we also export. So, yeah, it's more on the end of imports. Net importing countries are going to feel the stronger effect of any tariff associated to the good they import. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. So we're here with Dr. Portes. We're talking about the Trump tariff plan. The next question, number 6, is will this new tariff plan impact our current negotiations with Mexico and Canada on the NAFTA agreement?
It will. It has. Phil, it's so interesting that this survey started in April of 2017. The investigation, there were public hearings, and then in March 23rd, it's when it was implemented. And then for our closest partners, Canada, Mexico, and the European Union, effective June 1st, they came into effect. So this affects negotiations, absolutely, because it's a card that the United States holds, right? If you're negotiating a trade agreement, and in the background you have the threat in place already of imposing these tariffs, which have been imposed, then it gives you a stronger bargaining position overall.
Great. So we're going to continue on here. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to ask those questions live. Our 7th question is, can you put into perspective the underlying cause of this debate and the nature of the trade deficit?
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, this is where we're going to take a little longer. The story comes this way. When we're doing a session like this, or when you're in a classroom, you can think of an onion, and you go layer after layer after layer to figure out what's the essence of the problem. When we're talking about trade policy, it's not an onion, it's a broccoli crown. There are so many areas that you have to look into and how they're interrelated. The first thing that I would like to outline is a distinction between policy and politics. Policy is usually informed by theory. It tells you what to expect, what can happen. And politics sometimes can be influenced by ideology. So these are two different extremes. I won't provide any opinion until maybe the very end. I will just want to introduce you to the picture, and then you'll be able to draw your own conclusions. So the story with trade deficits has to do, that's something that's not mentioned too often, on the savings rate of a nation. So from the country perspective, the difference between exports and imports reflects the difference between saving of the country and investment of the country. Investment in this case understood as infrastructure, equipment, structures, software. human capital can even be included, but that would be longer term in investment in capital. Think of physical capital, yeah, factories, roads, airports. And what's happening is that a country whose savings is less than what they invest, they're going to be running a trade deficit. Yeah, that's from the national perspective. So what's happening in this case, and what makes the discussion very difficult when we are talking about individual trading partners, is think of the deficit as a latex glove. Yeah, you can inflate it. It's going to look like a balloon. But if you press on one finger, the air is going to go to another finger, right? So if we're squeezing hard now on China or Mexico or Canada, that is not going to solve the deficit, because it's the air inside the globe that matters. And just to illustrate a little bit the story, the U.S. deficit in 2017 was in the order of $600 billion. 375 billion were with China, so more than half. That's what makes it such a big target. And when you consider these numbers, what I'm saying is that the U.S. has lower savings compared to investment than China. China is a country that saves a lot. Just to put it in perspective, individual savings, particularly households, they save in the order of 25% of their income. U.S. households save around 2.5% of their income. So those extra savings go into Chinese banks, and they go into the rest of the world, to somebody who wants to borrow them. We borrow, we developed our infrastructure. National saving is not only household savings. There's also savings by firms, it's savings by the government. The government in China is running a surplus. Chinese firms are running high savings as well. So together, households, firms, and the government have a high savings rate in China, close to 46% of their income, their GDP. In the US, once we consider the three of them, we're talking about 18% of our income. And that is the big imbalance that we are observing. Why does it happen? It happens because in China, for instance, which is still a developing country, even though it's the second largest economy in the world, in the late 70s, when they moved towards a more market-oriented economy, many safety nets were dismantled. Provision of work by the government in state-owned enterprises was more uncertain. There were no more housing subsidies. So people had to take on their savings into their own hands. At the same time, this market opening increased inequality in China. And the bigger the inequalities, understood that there are going to be higher savings. This is also related to a relatively shallow financial market in China, where people have to save a lot for down payments on cars, down payments on houses. So the financial system is not as developed, and the same applies for companies. The US, on the other hand, is the opposite. We have access to large amounts of credit. Households don't need to save as much. So structurally, that's the main difference. That's the macro perspective. Now, since we're talking about steel tariffs, let me tell you the micro story of the steel industry. There are two parts to it. First has to do with going back to the end of the Second World War. Europe had been decimated by the war, a lot of their infrastructure. And then in a town in Austria, in the city of Linz, they developed a new technique for making steel. So there are basically three ways of making steel: open heat, basic oxygen, which is what these people did in Austria, and there's also the electric arc. The last two are much more efficient, and since 1948, it took about 15 or 20 years for the US to jump on board of that technology. So that put us in a competitive disadvantage. So that's where part of the lag comes. And also there's the natural transition of economies as they evolve. You go from an agriculture sector, manufacturing, to services. And manufacturing and agriculture have been shrinking relative to the size of the economy. So that is one point. And technology is also to blame. For instance, just another small story from Austria, because lately with the story on steel, many articles have come up. There are two very good ones from Bloomberg. It's from a factory close to Leoben in the southwest of Austria, where 14 people can produce 500,000 tons of steel a year. 14 people. And 500,000 tons of steel is what the US imports from Italy on a given year. Right? We import from China about 750,000, so just 50% more than that. But that's the way technology has evolved. This factory is expecting for this year as well to be completely automated in the manufacturing of airplane parts. Yeah, so this is high-end steel. So that's part of the story. We go back to World War II. It's the development of technologies, the late adoption of these technologies in the US, and now we have a US industry that is not as competitive as we would want it to be. So that's part of the story. And then I just want to address something in terms of the scale of the situation. Total employment, based on the government's report, total employment in the steel industry is hovering around 150,000 workers. Estimates are that these tariffs can create up to 25,000 new jobs. 25,000 new jobs would be about the size of a sports arena. Yeah, so keep that in perspective. As I mentioned before, there are about 5 million jobs associated to steel production. So 25,000, now we're talking about 5 million. And then the bigger picture has to do with the overall US labor market. The latest figures that just came from May is a very low unemployment rate of 3.8%. About 293,000 jobs were created in the single month of May. Yeah, 293,000 versus 25,000 that we were saying. And that's not only what's striking. The US labor market is very dynamic. The turnover in the labor market is very large. For instance, in the month of May, 5.3 million jobs there were 5.3 million hires, right? And 5.1 million layoffs in the whole nation. So the churn in the labor market is huge. The focus on one industry, it's important because these are livelihoods of people. However, we cannot really want to go back into the past. Just as an example from agriculture, in the 1900s, 40% of the US population worked in agriculture. Now it's 1.5%. And that doesn't mean that we would want to return to such a setting. So just to sort of wrap it up and provide you with some final thoughts, has to do with this. The rationale of the capacity utilization going from 70% to 80% has mostly to do with operating margins in the industry. Our partners are actually below such capacity utilization. Europe, China, Canada, Mexico, it's only about 75% of that capacity utilization. And what is a bit concerning is that the same way this investigation was launched in April of 2017, there was a new announcement for cars and car parts, the automobile industry, under the same criteria of national security. So the question is whether that such argument can fly. And what we are all waiting this weekend is the G7 meeting in Canada, where our biggest trading partners are meeting, and they'll have something to say. Just a final thought, Canada is our largest trading partner. Mexico is the second largest. China is the third largest. Altogether of Europe would become the largest partner. And unfortunately, this situation has been politicized. The retaliation that our trading partners are targeting has to do with political districts, with the nature of the products that are produced in different states. So As I was telling you about this broccoli crown, what we used to be a trade situation is mostly taking the tones of a political situation and bringing a lot of uncertainty in international markets.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Portes. So let's finish with the question is, will it cause a trade war?
Yes, we are in a trade war. These tariffs that have been exempted for several countries, including Mexico and Canada and the EU in March when they came on, now they're being reapplied since June 1st. Canada has said that by July 1st, they'll have their own list. Mexico has announced their own list of products, and the European Union is going to do the same. So I think, yes, we are already there.
Great. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Portes, for your time. We'll see you next week at next week's Feliciano Live. This video will be available on Facebook in the next couple minutes if you'd like to reference it in the future. So thank you all.